Hello everyone and welcome to my 10-minute presentation. Today I will be going over how scientists are tracking nanoparticle aggregation in natural aquatic systems, specifically looking at tin oxide nanoparticles. Before I start, I'd like to give an overview of both some familiar concepts and novel concepts either discussed today in this presentation or in my final 25-minute presentation. Some familiar topics include that of colloidal science, which nanoparticle aggregation falls under. We'll look at electrolytes, specifically looking at their characteristics, such as ionic strength, kinetics, and pH levels. Van der Waals forces, which we know are always present when we talk about particle interactions. Some instrumentals are that of differential light scattering and spectroscopy. And finally, that of semiconductors, since tin oxide falls under that category. Some novel concepts include that of aggregation. It is novel to us undergraduates, thus it needs to be defined and explained. That also constitutes for DLVO theory, which is a colloidal theory used to explain aggregation. Some new instrumentation that actually both of my primary papers use is that of nano tracking analysis, NTA, and this Zeta Sizer nano apparatus. Finally, testing parameters related to colloidal science will be discussed. I will give some examples when I start to talk about the papers and their importance. To understand aggregation and why it is a problem in these aquatic systems, we must define aggregation and what it is. So aggregation occurs when these nanoparticles combine into these clusters. We know that nanoparticles are interactive due to their high reactivity. There are two types of aggregation. The most simplistic is that here of homoaggregation, which occurs when two or more similar nanoparticles combine into these clusters. However, the aggregation that constitutes two aquatic systems is that of heteroaggregation. So first off, tin oxide nanoparticles are disposed into these waterways, either unintentionally or intentionally. Tin oxide is a common nanoparticle used in commercial products due to their attractive chemical properties, which is that of their high reactivity, their low toxicity in synthesis, as well as being a good semiconductor, which I had said earlier, which makes it a main ingredient in sunscreen products. When they're disposed into these aquatic systems, they aggregate with the contaminants and species already found in the water. Unfortunately, they're automatically consumed by these aquatic life, and that aggregate, once in their bodily systems, can aggregate again with the animal's DNA, further causing harm to the animal and that animal's food chain. So we can see that aggregation is a real problem in these systems. Thus, scientists need to track aggregation to further understand these nanoparticles' transport, fate, toxicity, and risk to the environment. So the question is, how are scientists exactly tracking nanoparticle aggregation? Well, to understand this, background theory is required. We are met again with this DLVO colloidal theory, which in its classical form states that the sum of the attractive and the repulsive forces happening in the interaction is what determines attachment. The forces that are at play are that of van der Waals attractive forces, which again, we know are present in any real particle interaction. Next is that of the electrostatic double layer, EDL, repulsive forces, which takes into account charge. We always know that charge is important when we look at interactions. So the EDL forces take into account the charge of the particles indicated in white and their surroundings and the interactions among them. This may seem like a good theory to understand aggregation. However, once we incorporate the nanoparticle characteristics into the theory, it presents challenges in the framework. Those challenges may include the nanoparticle's shape, their size, their structure, the chemical composition with which they're in, and macromolecules, which are used as surface coatings in the manufacturing of these particles. These challenges may seem like limitations. However, scientists are using these challenges as a guide to understand aggregation and understand the inner workings of this interaction. Now, when scientists look specifically at aggregation in aquatic systems, they look at the composition of the water, they look at the characteristics of the aqueous system, and they also look at the size of the nanoparticles and how they're changing in relation to this chemical composition. Now, the first paper takes into account both these challenges by looking at two specific common pollutants found in the water. First is that of natural organic matter, which they represent here as humic acid. And it is commonly found in fertilizers, among other things. And it is a large molecule, as we can see, that contains all of these polar groups. So we know that charge and sterics will be huge when we look at the interactions with tin oxide. So those polar groups include, but aren't limited to, carboxylic groups and phenyl hydroxyls, which they talk about a lot in the paper. Second is that they look at heavy metal ions, which they represent here as lead. They don't specify why they use lead exactly, only that it is to represent the ions found in sewage water that unfortunately makes their way into these natural water systems. In short, they look at the joint effects between these two pollutants in the aggregation of tin oxide nanoparticles. What's interesting about this paper is that it not only looks at the binary system, which is the tin oxide and one of the pollutants, they compare the binary system to a tertiary system in which all of the species are aggregating with each other. In synthesizing this tertiary system, they look at contact order. Contact order matters. So they synthesize these three addition sequences in which they mix and stir the binary system, and they eject immediately the third species. And what they test from each sequence is that they look at the increased concentration of lead and look at the effects on the tin oxide nanoparticle size, whether it's getting larger or smaller. They look at zeta potential, which is this parameter that measures the stability of the dispersion. They look at the fluorescence of humic acid. This fluorescence is supposed to mimic the mechanisms occurring in the aggregation. And they use supplementary information to verify their findings. And those supplementary information include that of attachment efficiency. It's also referred to as sticking efficiency. It is the probability of when and where these particles will attach to each other. So it's an aggregation kinetics approach. They also have this concentration parameter, which states what is the highest concentration that I can have before the nanoparticles start to solidify in these clusters to the point where testing parameters are no longer obtainable. To compare to the second paper also looks at the binary system between this natural organic matter, humic acid, and tin oxide nanoparticles. However, they incorporate the fact that tin oxide is a great semiconductor, so it participates in photocatalysis with the sun. So they take into account the sun's effects on aggregation. Here's a little animation for you to understand photocatalysis. So when the sun makes in contact with these particles, it excites the particle and creates this photo-generated electron hole. Now, this hole can oxidatively interact with the species surrounding them, making these highly toxic oxidation species, which include but aren't limited to the superactive oxidation species and free radicals. So it creates toxicity and damages over time. To understand the paper, they synthesize it similar to the previous paper, and that they create this binary system by mixing and stirring. But they also sonicate the solutions using a UV light to incorporate the sun's effects or to simulate the sun's effects. They also adjust the pH of the environment, so they make manipulations to that chemical composition of the aqueous system. Testing parameters are also similar to the previous paper in that they look at zeta potential, specifically pH effects on the zeta potential. They also look at the fluorescence of humic acid to understand the mechanisms as well. However, it's more supplementary information in this paper. Some novel evaluations include that of applying the theoretical DLVO theory to their empirical data, which has a lot of interesting findings. In short, my seminar outline will be much similar to what I've done today, and that it will include an introduction to heteroaggregation in aquatic environments, specifically looking at tin oxide. Then I will divide the two papers, explaining their experimental approaches and explaining their results. Throughout the discussion of these papers, I will make comparisons to each other, similarities and differences, if you will. At the end, I will provide limitations from both papers that can be led to further discussion, which will lead to a Q&A where people can ask questions and I will give answers to them. Here's my works cited. The one with the two different bullet points are that of my primary papers I talked about today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope to see you all in my 25-minute presentation. Have a great day.